You know, when I study the Gospel of John, I see a person that knew Jesus very well. And you know that John was very close to Jesus. He was very close to his heart. And when you read his writings, sometimes you have the feeling that while John was so close to Jesus, he might have had a chance to open the heart and see the heart of God. Because how he presents Jesus is wonderful. Actually, when you go to the letters of John, the first letter of John, chapter 5, you will find the verse where John is saying, if you have the Son, you have life. But if you don't have him, you don't have anything. You don't have life. And in chapter 5, he concludes chapter 5, very interestingly, he speaks about Christ, and he says, Jesus Christ, he is the true God and the eternal life. And so when we go today to the Gospel of John, we will look at chapter 5. But let us keep in mind the main point of John to really reveal to us the beautiful character of Christ. John chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. I mean, this is a very known passage. I'm sure many of you have preached many times, myself also. But lately I was studying this passage from a different angle. And I was trying to understand this passage in the light of the main mission of John to really portray and show and demonstrate who really God is. And so let us read John chapter 5, verse 1 and the following. After this, there was a feast of the Jews. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In this lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever diseases he had. You know, this passage, verse 4, created so much trouble for the scholars, even from the beginning, so that even many manuscripts don't have it. And how to understand it? How was the angel of the Lord going down and stirring up the waters? But it's really not difficult if you try to understand it from the Hebrew way of thinking. Because the Hebrew mind understood everything good that is here on earth comes from whom? From God. There is no good without God. And so if you have a pool that has healing waters, it's from whom? From God. And you know, it's not a unique situation here. You have, even today, in many places, for example, in Ukraine, in the mountains, you have a number of pools where from time to time, the water, you know, just comes out from the ground. And it's a very concentrated water, and it really heals a number of diseases. Actually, the scientists are studying it and really verifying it, not only theoretically, but practically they see people are healed. Because when the sources are really pushing the water out, it comes with a certain, you know, concentration of some elements that treat certain sicknesses. And so, but the pools are not constantly, you know, pouring water from the ground from time to time. And occasionally, and probably, something like this happened close to Jerusalem. But this is not the main point of the story. And then he continues and he speaks, now a certain man was there who had an infirmity, 38 years. When Jesus saw him laying there and knew that he already had been at that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me. Jesus said to him, Rise, take up your bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. Now it is very interesting when you study this chapter. You know, the Gospels are written in a very short, almost, we can say, telegraphical style. In a few sentences, they give us a sea of information. And when someone writes a telegram, every word counts. And so there are several references that from the first look at them would not be necessary for the story. For example, he speaks about a feast. What does it have to do with the story? Now, what is very interesting, John very often refers to feasts. For example, you go to chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 10, chapter 11, John speaks about feasts. But you know what is very interesting? Whenever John speaks about feasts, he always gives the name of the feast. For example, if there was a Passover feast, he speaks and he says it was a Passover feast, or the Passover feast was nearing. He always referred by name what kind of a feast it was. But here in chapter 5, he makes an exception. He does not call the feast by name, just says there was a feast of the Jews. Now, why has he done so? In reality, what John wanted to tell us, you know, if he would have connected the feast with a name, we would be probably trying to understand what does it mean, how to connect the message that follows with the feast, with the content, with the meaning of the feast. But he didn't want it. He just wanted us to understand that there was a feast. Doesn't matter what feast, but there was a feast. And what does it mean, a feast for the Jews? You know, Jews knew how to celebrate feasts. I think in Kenya also you know how to celebrate. When there is a feast, there is a feast. And no one sleeps when there is a feast. You know, in Jerusalem, when there were feasts, people were pouring from all parts of Judea, Samaria, even some of them, and from Galilee, they were coming to celebrate. But John portrays the picture, and he wants us to keep in mind there was a feast. There was a good mood. There was a celebration. Everyone was trying to go to the feast, to Jerusalem. But then suddenly, he changes the picture and says, but there was a place close to Jerusalem, close to the center of the feast. There was a place where it looked totally different. And he says there was a hopeless place. While everyone was rushing to Jerusalem to celebrate, he says there was a place where a person was who could not celebrate. A person who felt himself thrown out from the main highway of this life. While the rest was anticipating big celebration, there was a guy who could not celebrate. And then what is very interesting, John mentions two more details that he could actually omit, but yet he wanted to make sure that we understand them. One of them is that he names the place. He gives us the name of the pool. And he wants to make sure that we give a right interpretation. And he says, not only he gives us the name, but he says, the Greek says, in Aramaic, the English version says, in Hebrew, it is called Bethesda. So John wanted to make certain that we will understand. And then another thing, when he speaks about the sick person, he gives a number of years that the sick person was already sick. And the number of years was 38 years. You know what is very interesting? Whenever a Jewish person at the time of Jesus heard the figure 38, he had a picture in mind immediately ready. You know, for every Jew who knew his scriptures, 38 meant a certain Old Testament book. You know, there is a book in the Pentateuch, the book of Numbers. When you study the book of Numbers, actually it describes the period of time exactly 38 years. The book of Numbers describes 38 years of wandering in a desert. We are accustomed to speak about 40 years. But you know, Exodus speaks of some, Deuteronomy of some, but the Numbers, the book of Numbers, speak exactly of 38 years. Now, what is very interesting, the name of the book of Numbers in Hebrew is not Numbers. In Hebrew, it is called In the Desert. So the name of the book is Desert. So as soon as Jesus said, I went to the pool of Bethesda and saw a man who was there 38 years, immediately picture of a desert, of 38 years wandering without reaching a goal, just running in a circle, 38 years, no hope. You know what he wanted to tell us? Now let's put all this information together. He says there was a feast of the Jews. There was a celebration. There was a great time, a time of joy. But he says not all could celebrate. There was a guy. Although he was located in a place called Bethesda, which actually means, if we translate it, the house of mercy. He said, although he was in a place called the house of mercy, there was no mercy. Because it was nothing more and nothing less than just desert, where a person was running in a circle without any results. Now, it is very interesting when you study the book of John, how John portrays Jesus. Chapter 1, he says, in the beginning was the Word. And he says it was who? Jesus, and he was God himself. Then you go to chapter 2. And the first miracle is presented in chapter 2. The wedding in Cana. You remember that? Now, the interesting thing is, there is a wedding, but there is no wine. John wants to tell us, without Jesus, there is no feast at the wedding. There is no wine. Then he continues, he moves on, and he says, Jesus is going and he cleanses the temple. And he says, what have you done with the house of God? You have turned it into a business center. What John wanted to tell us, he wanted to say to us, without Jesus, there is no house of God. In the house of God, there is no God without Jesus. It's just another business. Because without Jesus, there is no God in the house of God. Then he continues and he speaks in chapter 3 about the new birth. And he tries to portray and say, new birth is impossible without Jesus. Then he goes to chapter 4 and says, without Jesus, there is no living water. You can drink and drink and drink and drink, but you still will be thirsty. Without Jesus, there is no living water. Then he continues speaking with the Samaritan woman and he says, Without Jesus, there is no true worship. If you don't have Jesus, you don't have a true worship. And then he comes to chapter 5, and he tells us, without Jesus, there is no mercy in the house of mercy. It's simply desert. But the good news, John describes and says, Jesus was going to the feast, to Jerusalem. But instead of going straight to the epicenter of celebration, he decided to turn aside, go to the place called mercy without mercy, and make out of the desert a place of mercy. And so he comes there, and he sees a sick person, and he asks the person, would you like to get well? Now it is very interesting. This person doesn't know Jesus yet. You know, very often, we also feel as if we are cast out of the main highway of the life. Don't you feel sometimes like this? You look at everyone else, looks like everything is going well in their families. They are never diagnosed with bad sicknesses. They even don't catch a cold. But you are suffering, or your family is suffering, or your kids. You might pray for them already 38 years, and you don't see any results. And you ask, what is happening, Lord? You feel outcasted. But John tells us, wait a minute. Wait a minute, there is only one thing you need. But in reality, what we think, we not only have our dreams, our goals to get well, but we also have a method how to do it. You know, we know what we want to accomplish today. Not only that, many have come here and they know what to do in order to reach the goal, right? The sick person lies there and looks at Jesus and says, yes, I want to get healthy, but there is only one way. And the way is through the water. And he looks at Jesus, the muscles are okay, the guy is quite healthy, he looks around, most of the people are gone, maybe now is the chance, and he says, maybe you can be the one to take me first in the water. You see what is happening? As we are running in the circles of our lives, as we are wandering for 40 years or 38 years in the desert, we have our picture, our understanding. We know what the Lord needs to do and how He should do it. But the Lord looks to us and says, you know what? We don't need water. Even in the desert, He says, we don't need water. The only thing we need is Jesus Christ. Because if you have me, you have everything. This is the main message of John. The one who has the Son has life. If you don't have the Son, you don't have the life. So the only thing you need is Jesus. Because wherever Jesus appears, things change. He comes to the wedding, and they have the best wine. He goes to the house of God, which was turned into the place of business. You know, when you travel from the airport to the Advent Hill, you go through the town where you have all these markets and the butchers, they sell all kinds of stuff. You know, sometimes our churches look exactly like this place because there is no Jesus. But if Jesus comes to the place of a market, the marketplace turns into the house of God. Then Jesus comes to Nicodemus and gives them a new birth. Wherever Jesus comes, there is a transformation. Things happen. Then he visits the woman at the well, and he gives her living water. And then he comes to the desert and makes out of it a house of mercy. And he tells the young fellow, not very young really, 38 years sick, he tells him, stand up and walk. And the guy stood up and went where? You know, if you continue reading chapter 5, they finally meet together at the epicenter of the celebration of the feast in Jerusalem, in the temple. This is the good news. It means Jesus will not celebrate without you. You feel yourself outcast. You feel yourself neglected, forgotten by your church, by your family, by everyone. But Jesus gives you a message. Remember, he says, I will not celebrate without you. You know, it is very interesting when you study some of the biographies of the great men of this world. And many of you know very well Karl Barth, this Swiss reformer, Reformation theologian. He was born in May 10, 1886, in Basel, Switzerland. And what is very interesting that he became very famous even during his lifetime. In fact, he became so famous that people were traveling from different corners of Europe to Basel just to visit the chapel or the university where he's teaching and just to have a picture of him, just to see him. And there is a story told that once one tourist came to Basel and he wanted to see Karl Barth, this great theologian. And they were riding in a trolley, and it happened that the tourist was sitting close to Karl Barth himself. But he had no picture of him, so he didn't know that it was Karl Barth himself. So the tourist turns to Karl Barth and asks him and says, do you know Karl Barth? And Karl Barth responds, says, no, I actually shave him every day. And then the story is told that the tourist went back home. It was enough for him, and he told everybody, his neighbors and friends, said, I couldn't see Karl Barth himself, but I saw his hair cutter who shaves his beard every day. And so Karl Barth, in 1962, for the first time in his life, visited United States at the age of 75. And this was the time when they put his picture on the cover of the Time magazine. And in 1962, when his first visit was to United States, he visited the University of Chicago and gave a presentation. And then one student asked him a question, and he said to him, he said, you are a very famous and very respected theologian. You have written so many books. But you know what was a problem in those days? That most of the theological works were written in German. And German language is a difficult one because some sentences are as long as half a page. You know, the famous dictionary, the New Testament dictionary, the Kittel, when it was translated into English, many German theologians said, now finally we can understand it also. Because in English the sentences are very short, but in German, you know, half a sentence. And so it was difficult to understand for many, even Karl Barth. And so the student asked him, could you somehow simplify the main message of your life? Could you just in one or two sentences summarize what is the heart of all your theological work? And Karl Barth responded very interestingly. And he said, yes, I will do it. And he said, and these are his words, I will do it in the words of a song, he said, I learned at my mother's knee. Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. This, he said, was the heart, the main task of his lifelong work of writing these difficult theological books. Don't worry. Jesus will not let you alone. Even if you will be sent to desert, He will come and turn the desert into the house of mercy. And then he says, remember, I will not celebrate. I will not go to the feast without you. We will do it together.